Greetings. I'm Paul Taylor, and I wish I could be there in person in Tokyo for this important workshop on USA-Japan museum cooperation. I feel as though I'm there in spirit, though, and I'm very glad that Dr. Robert Poncion and Claire Eckert, my colleagues from the Smithsonian, are there in person. I'm virtually greeting you to talk about my subject, very briefly, museum collections beyond borders. Actually, this is in a way an opportunity for me to briefly update a few ideas that I was very honored to present 20 years ago this month in Tokyo. So let me just share my screen. And as I share my screen, I want to take the opportunity also to sincerely thank our good friends and colleagues at Meiji University who are hosting this workshop, including Professors Yamada, Sasaki, Inoue, and Yamauchi, and many others who've helped with our long-term cooperation between our two institutions. I also want to thank the US Embassy in Tokyo and all its staff for their help and assistance in carrying out our prior webinars and workshops and other joint activities. My topic is museum collections beyond borders. And as I have mentioned, here I'm trying to turn, yes, as I've mentioned, this updates something that I talked about 20 years ago this month at the Edo Tokyo Museum. On the table on the right there, I'm third from the left among several other more distinguished people than I was. But I was talking about at the beginning of the 21st century, the trends for museums in the 21st century. And I think some of those have held up pretty well. That got a lot of coverage, including the newspaper that was the sponsor of the workshop. Here we are again. And our joint efforts with colleagues in Japan, including Edo Tokyo Museum and others, has never stopped. And I'm very pleased to thank Meiji University for the recent series of webinars, which you can see up on our playlist here. And they're referenced also on the Meiji University website, where each webinar can be found. But there was a very good series of lectures that we did jointly together. Now, museum collections beyond borders really refers to something that I was talking about 20 years ago, which is the increasing globalization and internationalization of all our efforts and the advantages of working together across borders with people from other countries. And when I say museum collections, let's look at an interesting change that took place just last year. According to the International Council on Museums, ICOM, the definition of a museum prior to 2022 had the major things that we all know. It's a non-profit making, it's a permanent institution. It collects things. It's not just like a gallery that borrows things and puts them up for study and for other purposes, and it's open to the public. One of the points I made 20 years ago, I'd like to make again now, in terms of museum cooperation beyond borders, and that is that really we work with many organizations that call themselves museums that don't meet this definition. And for all the people listening to this workshop now who are maybe students in Japan or elsewhere, I think it's important to note that if you're in the field of museum studies and learning how to do museum work, you're learning skills that are applicable to many other organizations besides museums. Increasingly, for example, the trend has continued that private corporations will hire curators for their art collections, which go on their walls or decorating, or maybe their own galleries. These are not just for purposes of decoration and public outreach and goodwill on the part of the public, but they are also good investments. So the investments that they're making in the artworks that they're putting on their walls may be going up in value faster than some of the materials that they're working on in terms of their raw products or the oil in the ground that they haven't dug up yet or whatever. So these can be good investments, and museum skills are applicable to many other fields. But in 2022, ICOM changed its definition. It's still not for profit. It's still permanent. It still does the collecting and the interpreting and exhibiting. But it added increasingly that it's open to the public, it's accessible and also inclusive, and specifically saying that museums now should have an obligation to foster diversity and sustainability. Sustainability in terms of our planet, in terms of our cultural heritage and traditions. These are among the sort of required elements of being a 21st century museum, which have now been formalized in the ICOM definition even. Of course, for us here, where I have the honor of being the curator of our historic Asian and European collections, we have always been fostering diversity. America is a diverse, ethnically diverse country, for example, and the heritage of all the peoples of the world is important. So we have an important Japanese collection. Then in 20 years ago and now, I was able to very quickly survey some of the things that we have. I have the honor of being the curator of these materials, including the material brought back by Commodore Perry from the earliest opening up and treaties between USA and Japan. This, by the way, is one of my favorite contemporary images of Perry. I have to say, it looks like the artist knew about him and heard about him, but didn't actually see him up close. He apparently heard that, like myself, Commodore Perry has blue eyes, not knowing how to present them. He made the iris of the eye the normal brown color, and the rest of the eye was blue. But anyway, the principle is there. That was Commodore Perry. And the important thing that we have been doing, we've lent material from the Perry collection for many exhibitions and also research on the material. So this is one of the examples of a publication that came out from our office about the Perry collection by my colleague, Chang-Su Jo Houchins. We have other important gifts. I won't be really talking about them in detail here. Dr. Pancion will surely, or has surely spoken about them on many occasions. But the point I want to make about museum collections across borders is that really the kind of research, interpretation, presentation, and so on of collections like these are not best done alone here, sitting in our libraries and our museums, but really working closely with our colleagues in Japan, the people who are descendants of those who created these collections. This was an important exhibition of one of the basket makers of Japan, that studied by Louise Court, a rural sort of village basket maker, whom I had the honor of meeting also when he visited here. And the exhibition was done at the Freer Sackler Gallery, part of the Smithsonian, but the collection is here in our anthropology department. So we work together with other museums inside the Smithsonian as well as with institutions in Japan. We also have tried to point out some parallelisms, for example, with the Ainu people and other Arctic peoples in our exhibition, Ainu, Spirit of a Northern People. One of the exhibits I'm most proud of, you've seen in the background of our very old, now gone Hall of Asian Peoples, was landscape kimonos. That was my English term for these, by, we say it as in English, Ichiku Kubota. Kubota Ichiku was the artist name of the person who created this series of textiles, which was one of our most popular exhibitions here. So we've had some very excellent exhibitions, and we also have some highly iconic collections that have really been symbols of good relations between our countries. One that has frequently been loaned for exhibitions, of course, is the famous Miss Japan doll. So since the Smithsonian was founded, we have had a mission not only of being a kind of national museum of the United States, but also an institution that was supposed to be increasing and diffusing knowledge. And that was worldwide, universal. This history of the Smithsonian began with a British scientist who donated the funds that he had assembled in case he had no heirs to establish an institution with this name in Washington with this mission. And there was a long period of debate whether the US should even accept this, and if so, what kind of institution should it be, a university, a library, or whatever. And it became something that was set up as what later became our National Museum system. Now, some of the things we think of as new, really fashionable 21st century trends actually date back to those earliest days. One is the idea of flexible museum space. You know, maybe that our museums should have flexibility so that the same rooms can sometimes be used for exhibits, and then another times they become public areas and they become places where you can have big events and dinners and receptions, and then you can have workspaces there. But actually, right from the beginning, the Smithsonian Castle, it's so called, its first building, completed in 1855, it was all these things: an art gallery, a laboratory, lecture hall, library, a science museum, and for that matter, not listed here, the secretary, the head of the Smithsonian, had an apartment up in the tower. So this was very flexible space. And our second building was the earliest so-called National Museum building, which opened in 1881, displaying both natural and cultural artifacts from around the world. This is one of the earliest images of such a display in our earliest National Museum. And I do want to point out in the left-hand image, along the top are Japanese no masks, because that was an important part of our early collections. And in fact, I'm curator for our anthropology collections, and they are numbered, you know, in catalog numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Our very first numbered collections are entirely consisting of the materials that Commodore Perry brought back from Japan. Now, this third building was the one that I'm speaking to you from now, our Natural History Museum, it's called now, but it was at that time called the National Museum, or the new National Museum building. It included the National Collection of Fine Arts at that time. Basically, since that time, the various components of the Smithsonian have split off. This remains as the Natural History Museum. But we now have a very large number of museums around the Smithsonian Mall here, the National Mall, as well as in New York and other places. So we have a total now of 19 museums, plus in December 2020, the US Congress initiated some new museums, which are in the planning stage now. So it has really grown, and the Smithsonian is at this time the world's largest museum complex. Now, when we look at collections beyond borders, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of materials with which we can establish collaborative relations with other countries across borders to work on in many ways. Plus, we're looking at examples of cooperation where we can contribute toward the study and presentation of collections from other countries as well. So we've got lots of different kinds of data, and that data is a real challenge to us, and picking the projects, you know, that we're going to specifically work on for any particular really interesting and hopefully successful contribution to our science and our understanding and our interpretation of the world and of humans' place in it. So let me just say, for people outside the museum field, that it's not a bad feeling at all to walk into your office every day and know you've got 100 really interesting projects that you could be working on, and your challenge is to pick the ones that you're going to be working on. So I want to present a few examples of these kinds of cooperation. Um, and I encourage people to do something that's even more important than what I'm doing now, which is to think of the next kinds of cooperation, potentially including those with the Japanese collection examples that I showed earlier. We have a lot of very massive collections consisting of large numbers of notes, field notes, film footage, photos, objects, maybe biological specimens. An example of that was the 1926 joint Smithsonian and Dutch expedition to New Guinea, Western New Guinea, now part of Indonesia. I've spent a lot of time there. And at that time, it was a Dutch colony. So because of the vast amount of material, we had to do something that has been really one of the biggest trends of the 21st century, which is the digitization and the placement online of information, publication online. And you can see this in a kind of research compilation of information gathered during that expedition, which is on the Smithsonian Library site. And I wrote this and launched it in an anniversary year, the 1926 expedition. Specifically, it was in 2006 in the Netherlands, at a big event in the Netherlands, on a day which was declared by Congress as Dutch and American Day for various historic reasons. So we launched it at the Museum of World Cultures in Leiden, Netherlands. And it brings together source material, that is various people's diaries from the expedition, old photographs, film footage, and so on. And also some interpretive essays that I prepared of different themes from that expedition. So when you have situations like this, lots of data on a topic, like an archaeological expedition, for example, that collects a lot of artifacts and also has massive numbers of photographs and everything else, preparing a website that brings it all together, this might be a model that will be of interest to you. Now, the other type of cooperation is a joint work with other countries. And I'm using an example from quite early in my career. In fact, that's me many years ago, shown in the picture there, looking at the old storage at the National Museum of Indonesia in Jakarta. They don't use this kind anymore, but this is the same kind that we had in the photograph I showed you with the no masks in the 1880s in the Smithsonian, and we still have some. I actually have one of these cabinets in my office here. But this is not the normal way of showing things now. But the collections were stored underneath the display areas. That actually was a very classic tradition, and it's still being used in many places. Now, what I want to mention about this is something that I really was pointing to 20 years ago and asked to talk about in Japan, which is the trend that I saw happening for international cooperation, that it would be a way to help to add new resources to our museum work, because we all know museums never have enough resources. It's almost it's almost an axiom that you never have enough funding and time and so on for all the things that you want to do. When we looked at what my colleagues in Jakarta wanted to do most, it was things like this. They pointed to an old object. The information about it had been misplaced, or the labels could be found, but it took some work because the label had fallen off, and it needed conservation and so on. So then they wanted to do this, and then basically when I asked, it was just to do that and maybe put it back in storage, but better known, better fixed up. The point that I was trying to make then and now is that very often the best way to do this is to actually do more, not less. So in this example, we were able to do the rediscovery of the information about the object, and also, restore it, and all the other things they wanted. But the way to do it was a much more massive project where we brought together collections from many countries, including our Smithsonian early Indonesian collections and from National Museum and Provincial Museums of Indonesia, to open an exhibition about Indonesia that traveled around the United States. And this was it, Beyond the Java Sea, Art of Indonesia's Outer Islands. You'll see at the very opening here in Washington, downstairs from where I am now, we had this piece. I wanted it there because it was how we first started discussing about maybe we could do something together, you know, working together to get this kind of thing done. And I said, it's easier to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for a project like this that's very visible than it would be to raise a couple of $1,000s to just fix something up in your storeroom and then put it back in storage. Nobody wants to do that. Anyway, it was a very successful project. This is the catalog from it. And I want to mention that there were many other activities associated with it as it traveled around the US and also to Jakarta. It went to Leiden in the Netherlands, and it went to 2 museums in Australia. So, you know, 7 venues on 4 continents, that's not bad. And one of the things I mentioned about international cooperation and about trends of museums in the 21st century is that the historic distinctions between science museums, art museums, history museums, and the different kinds of museums, which I don't have time to talk about now, but I did talk about it in the past in other seminars, and I've written about this. That historic distinction is in some areas breaking down a lot, and partly because it is so expensive and complex to make a big, beautiful exhibition. And when you want to travel an exhibition, the venues are of different kinds. So you have to make the kind of exhibition that's acceptable to all of the different kinds. It had to be good for a science museum and also for an art museum. This one opened at a natural science museum. It came to a natural history museum, went to a fine arts museum. It went to the National Museum of Jakarta. It went to a World Cultures Museum in the Netherlands, and so on. So there's a lot of cross fertilization. And then the other thing is the connection, the integration of outreach and education functions around these big projects. We had family guides, a film festival, a library exhibit, and so on. And then the traveling. This is the brochure in San Francisco. And then also in Leiden, here it is with the information in Dutch. And you had a small mini catalog that I put together for this exhibition when it traveled at the 2 museums in Australia, and so on. So in addition to the cross-fertilization that comes from sharing collections and traveling exhibits, there are also more now joint projects that are being encouraged by governments. And this was an early one at the beginning of the 21st century, IPAM, International Partnerships Among Museums. It was funded partly by the US Department of State. And this was our project with the National Museum of Saudi Arabia, where we worked together to create a website on their collections, and the launch was here in Washington. Now, since that time, this website has been updated and is still visible, but the partnerships can be of this kind. And the sort of seed money came from that IPAM grant, but much more, once we had established the partnership, much more came from other sources afterwards. You know, we have collections from many countries and often have worked together. This was a catalog that we did of our Thai royal gifts to the United States. And that's inherently a diplomatic collection. This is by far the best book that has ever been written about our royal gifts from Thailand. And it's still very much used. And we recently revised the website for this, and it's hosted now by the Siam Society under royal patronage in Bangkok. So this was really another joint project. When it comes to doing joint projects, one of the best examples, I think, and it's kind of my last example because we don't have much time, is the long-term project begun in 1985 for Korean heritage here in our museum, because we have like collections from Japan, historic diplomatic collections, early diplomatic collections from Korea. Now, the project began with local Korean American contributions in a series of events, but it really got a big jumpstart when we developed a partnership with the National Folk Museum of Korea. And that's me there when I'm with all my colleagues from Smithsonian and from Korea, as we signed a memorandum of understanding, which we normally don't even like to do, but sometimes other people like it, so we go along with it. We have a joke here, a good memorandum of understanding, and about $4 will give you a good cup of coffee. In other words, you could get a good cup of coffee without the memorandum and the $4. But some people like these MOUs, as we call them. We don't, but since other countries seem to like them, we do go along sometimes and we make a big deal out of it. But what's more important than any MOU, and a lot of this happened without the MOU, is just a sequence of events. You have to have regular events. So we established what we call a Korean Heritage Fund. I think this is a very good plan to set up a sort of gift fund that anybody can contribute to. Doesn't have to be a lot of money. They can give $10, they can give $5, they can give $1,000, $100,000. But this specifically has to be for a particular purpose. And this is for Korean heritage activities here. So we, with little contributions and some big contributions, we were able to build a series of events. This is a 100th anniversary of Korean immigration, an exhibition about Korean immigration to the United States called Korean American Century. That's ambassador of Korea at the opening. This is the 20th anniversary concert that we did in 2005 at the Music Center in Strathmore. We're just, 1,000 people can be happily celebrating things like this because they're aware of how many events we've done over the course of the decades of having a Korean Heritage Project. So we develop a lot of supporters. And I think, some years we are really busy with other things and we're trying to finish a book about Indonesia or whatever. And we just have to remind ourselves, we can't go this whole year without having a few Korean events because we've got that loyal group of supporters. I think a lot of our partnerships with the Japanese museums from those early days, 20 years ago even, they were interested in this kind of activity and how we develop the support that's not from the government, that's really from friends groups and from fundraising. And so this is one of the things that I said was going to be a 21st century trend. And I have to say, 20 years later, the percentage of the money that comes to the Smithsonian from private sources, as opposed to the government, has increased steadily. And to my surprise, and everybody else's surprise, you think of the government support is what you really need for your fundamental structural things, like taking care of the building, things like that. And then you do little fun parties and so on with private support, but it doesn't have to be just that way. And I do want to mention that because when we planned for the Korea Gallery, we picked a very prominent location for it, right above the entrance of our museum. But the problem with that is that location had been closed off for a long time, and I knew it was just the perfect place. It looked like this, the storeroom. It did not even have finished electricity and so on. So we had to build structural work needed to transform this into a potential exhibition space and really build new walls, new electrical, everything. And that is not usual when you just are raising funds from external sources. But we've managed in this case and in some other cases. And the transformation was very dramatic. We were able to build a very successful exhibition. And it was probably the most of all the Korea galleries that have been built. It was one of the most successful in terms of visitation because it was available for 7 million visitors in many years to actually visit this place. Here we are at the opening of the Korea Gallery, and these are all products of our Korean Heritage Project. We don't have a Japan Heritage Project. Maybe we should. We're from the early days, as I showed this woodblock print from the Perry expedition. We have so many interesting artifacts and such good memories of tremendous cooperation with all our Japanese colleagues. I do look forward to more. I'm open to everybody's suggestions. And I want to thank again everybody who has hosted this workshop. And I look forward to hearing more when Dr. Pancion and Ms. Eckert come back about ideas that they've all exchanged there in person. I wish I could be there. Thank you very much for your attention.